I'm wondering if the deck can go back to the first opening slide. That would be great. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. My name is David McInnes, and delighted to be back in Winnipeg. This is actually my fourth trip here in the last several months. Really pleased to be here. I was thinking about the last discussion, and someone mentioned a rising tide lifts all boats. I sort of feel like I can comment on this. I'm from Nova Scotia originally, and that really works, except when there's a hurricane. When there's a hurricane like Hurricane Fiona that took place when I was in Nova Scotia in September and hit the Atlantic area, it was a full onslaught because a high tide with strong winds creates a storm surge that can wipe out docks and boats and moorings and cause considerable environmental damage. And I think there's a sort of an interesting lesson here, is that when we talk about the win-win from the rising tide, we all want that, but we have to be pretty attentive to what the potential risks are. And I think that, and be ready for that. And I think there's a little bit of a parallel about how when we think about sustainability, we want the win-win outcome. We want the win-win for producers, the sector, for Canada and for consumers and for the environment and so forth. But we also have to really recognize and stay tuned to the unpredictability and the chaos and change that's out there. So I just was listening carefully to what was being said just a moment ago. I'm going to go through a program initiative very quickly. There's a lot in here, and I hope that this may give you a bit of an update on what's happening around sustainability from a ground-up, bottom-up perspective. But let me just start with this first question. Now, you are doing so much, and your forefathers and foreparents had done so much to be sustainable and provide the food we eat. But how do we actually know that agriculture and food in this country is sustainable? And if we actually answer this question, how do we leverage this in policy discussions, in the marketplace for our export markets, and build trust with consumers? This is what we have to identify. You may understand and you know how sustainable you are, but how do we really know? Where's the data? And that's what I'd like to focus on today. So here is the issue as I see it. This is the global perspective. And the global perspective is that we are facing a crisis and that essentially agri-food globally is not sustainable. It's not healthy and not inclusive. And this is affecting every single aspect of the agriculture and food business today. How we operate, compete, regulate, invest, lend, buy. It's permeating many of these discussions all over the world and to some degree here in Canada. This is the issue that we all are facing. But here's the opportunity. If we can better show our progress on the sustainability journey, can this actually help define and shape that global narrative, position Canada better, and also can it derive value for producers, the sector, and the country as a whole? This is the big opportunity that we're all facing. And so this is behind the initiative. That's the essential point. How can we then develop, as a group, the country's first Agri-Food Sustainability Index to find those metrics to demonstrate the leadership and the progress that we're making to be more sustainable? This is a bottom-up initiative. There are 117 partners, private, public sector driven. Producers are a key part of this and have been here since the beginning. We also have processors, retailers, financial institutions, environmental, social governance groups, indigenous organizations, innovation organizations, academia, 3 levels of government. I know I'm going to leave someone off that long list. Many of you, or a number of you, are actually partners in this initiative. But what is happening is that this is a pre-competitive, so-called pre-competitive, deeply collaborative process to answer that key question that I presented at the beginning. How can we demonstrate our sustainability and leverage that for value? This is the initiative that's building some pretty interesting momentum, and partners are coming on every day. Last week, dairy farmers and the Royal Bank were included. All right, I'm going to step back just a wee bit and just talk a little bit about what's happening. None of this should really be a surprise, but it does form the backdrop of how we're thinking about sustainability and what we need to do to go forward. So, what's the burning platform? There's a lot on this slide. I mentioned how the global narrative, if you will, is being defined by a feeling that the food production around the world and food sector, agriculture, is not sustainable. This is shaping the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the race to net zero, biodiversity goals, all sorts of global responses. But whatever we think of those goals, it actually is having 5 profound impacts that's affecting how we produce and supply food here and around the world. I'm going to go through a few of these in some of my slides, but basically, we're seeing new trade and rules and terms of market entry being shaped by this view. We're seeing companies, countries, producers, sectors competing on sustainability targets. Benchmarking is taking place on every single aspect of your business and those of other producers. Every single aspect. There's a rising call for greater standardization. This can be good and this can be bad, but standard measures are coming. And finally, we're also seeing, someone mentioned ESG, environmental social governance. This is driven by the capital markets, by banking regulators around the world. Mandatory ESG disclosures are coming. I'm going to elaborate on what that might mean for you. So, 5 pretty big shifts are affecting the agriculture food sector around the world and here in Canada. I'm just going to touch on this. So you might not be able to see all this, but we like to think, I believe in Canada, that we're one of the most sustainable and trusted food systems anywhere. But so do our competitors and our suppliers and peer countries. Everyone, quote unquote, is trying to figure out how they can be better positioned and differentiate on trust and sustainability all over the world. So what does that say then about how we need to step up to compete? Well, here in Canada, our ministers of agriculture, federal, provincial, territorial, came out with a statement back in 2021, among other things. And these, as you well know, they're setting the framework for how the sector is funded and regulated and promoted and so forth. Included in here is a statement about we want to be recognized, we, the ministers of agriculture, want to be recognized as a world leader in sustainable agriculture and agri-food production. Then there's been the more recent sustainable agriculture policy strategy that's come out from Agriculture Canada, who is also a partner, by the way. They too have sort of reflected this vision or this claim. In our view, the only way to truly demonstrate that is to have some form of a metric or benchmark to actually mark progress on this. But Canada is doing its part, think of that last slide of countries positioning, to position itself on that global stage and in the domestic marketplace. This slide is interesting because it actually touches on a comment that was made earlier about General Mills. And that is that target setting, how companies and sectors are positioning themselves, one of those big shifts, is that food companies, for them to make targets on GHGs, water, biodiversity, whatever they may set, largely speaking, they need to commit ingredient suppliers in their supply chains, because most of the environmental impact, in this case, nearly 90% of GHG emissions, are found with their supply chains. So this is creating a very interesting dynamic, which I'm going to get to. General Mills, 85% of its water use and impact is found within its supply chains, notably growers. So companies that set targets to respond to the marketplace need to work with you in order to deliver on them, or will have to increasingly. On the other hand, producers and subsectors themselves are stepping up and setting targets, such as grain growers and the dairy farmers, and they are setting net zero targets. What they're doing is that in order for them to deliver, it's the same thing. They need to commit not only themselves as organizations, they need to commit the food system players, NGOs, governments, suppliers, financing organizations to help them get there. What I'm getting at is that the targets that are being set in the marketplace demands better evidence and really genuine collaborations to get there. This is happening all over the world. This is an interesting slide. You might not be able to read the fine print. I'll try to do justice to it. We may say, we don't need to benchmark, we're sustainable. Okay. We will be continued to be measured. Here's how Canada stands. One performance environmental index sees that agriculture sustainability in this country, which they defined as 2 indicators, nitrogen management, sustainable pesticide use, we rank 64th. We think that we're one of the best, most sustainable, trusted food systems on the planet. According to them, we're 64th. Another one looks at a variety of sustainable agriculture indicators. We're 36th. Then looking at all of how Canada, this is not just agriculture, this is Canada, performs in those UN Sustainable Development Goals, which goes way beyond agriculture. We're 29th. So for a G7 country that purports to be one of the most trusted food systems on the planet, I don't know if I'd want to use that to differentiate myself in the marketplace. Now, there's issues here of methodologies. These initiatives are comparing all sorts of countries, and Canada's agriculture context is very different than Europe's or Brazil's or pick your country. And so this is actually the point. We need to figure out how we can genuinely, credibly benchmark ourselves, because if we don't do it, we will continue to be benchmarked by others. ESG was mentioned a minute ago. This is, I think, a catalytic change. This is huge. And that is that global regulators, these are the regulators that regulate the securities markets. Your pensions, your investments are tied to this. Canada Pension Plan's tied to this. They are requiring disclosure of climate-related risk for the entire financial services industry. This, in turn, is being adopted by the banks and other lenders and financial intermediaries who are adopting targets, in this case net zero. And in order for banks to fulfill the requirements for their shareholders of their net zero commitments and to fulfill what's required by the regulators around the world, including the SEC in the United States, they need to commit their borrowers. They need to commit their borrowers. They need to assess the risk across their portfolios and the opportunities for climate risk and other related sustainability risks. This has a profound impact. And right now we're seeing what's happening, as you'll see in a second, at a top-level impact. This will reach back to, ultimately, over time, every single borrower and financial player in the marketplace. We may think, well, government is doing this, the consumer is fickle, I don't want to comply with targets being set by companies not based in Canada. Put all that aside. Pay attention to this. So that was the stick. This might be the carrot. Sustainable finance, mentioned earlier as well. Here is Maple Leaf Foods and Bunge. They've been rewarded with sustainability finance options, lower cost interest on their debt because of their sustainability program meeting the bank's requirements for sustainability action. So this is a positive development. This is only at the high-end corporate. This is not at the mid-level or small borrower level. That will take some time to flow through. But this is how new instruments are being developed to pursue the sustainability agenda I just pointed out. Major development. Probably a few of you, I didn't hear about this till some time ago, some time ago. The International Sustainable Standards Board, it's a new organization, a consolidation of some existing others. It's basically to set the ESG standard for every company around the world. It was endorsed by Canada, the G7, the G20. This is environmental social governance factors. And in fact, it's in response to a really important issue to prevent greenwashing, because there's a chaotic environment out there about disclosures, and are they genuine, are they meaningful? There's some mischief about how people are declaring their sustainability, talking about companies. And so this is an attempt to try to bring some order to the chaos. This will have significance, again, for anyone in the marketplace over time and for borrowers. So what are the learnings from just what I've shared? 3. I think whoever defines sustainability wins. Think of those benchmarks. Whoever defines sustainability wins. That has influence on standards development and new global rules. Where does that leave Canada? We will be measured. We will measure or be measured. I mentioned that already. We can do nothing, and we're going to be subjected to all the measures that are being developed out there in the marketplace, and clearly the bar is still rising. This is not going to go away. This is only intensifying, it being the sustainability measures that we're seeing underway. Okay, so that's some of the early learnings of our work of the coalition. When we first started, we were trying to scope out, well, what's going on? What do we have to do? Why do we have to respond to this? This was sort of reflective of our early work. So what the response is to all that coalition, remember, this is not, I should add, a government initiative. Government is very much an important partner in this. This is a bottom-up driven coalition that's responding to this together. So what we came up with was, let's develop the National Index on Agri-Food Performance. And as was mentioned earlier, this sort of builds a little bit, tweaks the 3 legs of the sustainability stool: people, profit, and planet. We added a 4th stool leg, if you will, block, food integrity, which I'm going to get into. Because food safety is very much part of the sustainability value proposition. And Canada's brand, sustainable, trusted, responsible, includes safe food. So let's call it out. It's an important part. So we've added, I suppose, that 4th leg to that stool. I'm going to get into detail here. There's a ton of information. I'm going to move very quickly through it. There's material on our website if you're interested. So pardon me for maybe not delving too deeply into everything, but the intent is to give you an overview. So what is this? Well, this is to provide a consolidated national picture from production to retail. It's to measure those 4 blocks. It's to emphasize outcomes-based, not necessarily practice-based, outcomes-based evidence, to show progress against national and global goals, to meet that environment that I pointed out. And this is really an opportunity to get aligned, to step up the disclosures, and to leverage it. But it's really important to note what this is not. This is not a prescriptive tool. This is not about telling anyone what to do. We are not measuring individual farms or companies, or frankly, we're not even scoring how Canada's doing. We're providing a baseline from which to really indicate how a food system that is Canada's ought to be measured, because we need this to respond to these changes in the marketplace. The other area is a little fuzzier, but we are not measuring consumer diets. This is not a consumer-facing label you'll see in a grocery store. This is really about getting our act together as a sector. And so one of the reasons why we're not measuring consumer diets, for example, which is part of the global indices and discussion, is we believe that social economic policy is not in the domain of agriculture and food. We had to draw the line and create we had to discern what was in and out of scope. Now there's some fuzziness here that I'm going to get into in a second. But this is basically what we're trying to do. And in a way, this initiative, or take the initiative, is really to intersect what's going on above us, globally, ESG, global goals, and so forth, with what you're doing, what producers, your sector organizations, and broader initiatives are taking place, as well as what's going on in Canada and the provinces, federally and provincially. And it's trying to figure out, how do we bridge the sustainable actions that you're undertaking and that of the sector, the progress we need to make, and how do we fit that with where this global and national agenda and provincial agenda is going. That's sort of what we're trying to do here. If we do this right, this is a basis we believe to derive value. So here are 4. One is that if we back up these claims we make about trust and sustainability and responsibility, can we leverage that in our market access opportunities to differentiate our foods? Can we create that? Can this actually benefit brand and competitiveness? Can this provide context for capital markets and lenders? Now, because we're not scoring individual firms or companies, this tool won't be used in a credit application because we're providing a consolidated view of sustainability. But what the index information could provide is context for risk assessment that may inform that credit or investment decision overall. Policy, I truly believe that with better data, better evidence, we can inform policy dialogues. And this is not pointed to government. This is for us all. The better evidence we have to express issues that are confronting us, hopefully the better the policy outputs can be. And I think that if we want to be a more sustainable food system, how do we align our innovation opportunities, our innovation initiatives, and our research to get there? It starts to create a bit of an agenda for how we can actually move forward better together. And for society, clearly by increasing transparency, acknowledging where we have some shortcomings, understanding and demonstrating where we are leaders, this is hopefully a way to build greater trust in the domestic and global marketplace. So these are big value drivers, but it has the potential. I'm not going to get into details, but we've been involved in quite a process since early 2020, benefited from the pandemic from the standpoint that we were able to do Zooms for everything. But right now we're in phase 3. We're now piloting this index. We're now trying to find all the data to set out to support the indicators, which I'm going to get into. And then this is leading to how do we set up an organization, a very modest one, or embedded in another organization to sort of keep this going. So we move from a 1.0 pilot to a more sophisticated and more useful tool, 2.0 and 3.0. That's where we're going. Lots of reports, lots of studies, lots of material on the website. We've tried to be very transparent. This has helped us to build momentum from a handful of partners early in 2020 to now 117, and I expect that number to actually go up. So we've tried to do our best to keep people informed and learn and get feedback along the way. That's sort of part of this process. I should also add that we've done a lot through some advice we've received from partners and others. How is this really going to be globally relevant? If a Canadian designed index speaks to our context, will people respect that? Will it be credible in the eyes of the global marketplace? It's a really good question. We decided not to simply adopt a global index and just slap a flag on it, Canadian flag, and say, here we go, because it was more important to have a ground-up buy-in and build this together than to sort of import an idea. The other is that Canada's agriculture sector is different than other countries. And so we need to tailor this so it's relevant here. But we did reach out to a whole lot of global organizations. The most recent was that we had a discussion with the European Commission last fall to have a dialogue on their expectations on sustainability. We can get into that. They've got a very different view versus what we're doing. And I think they appreciate that discussion. Anyway, I could spend a lot of time in this one slide, but we have tried to be as globally relevant as we can, and more to come. Now, this is the index that was published in May 2022. It's very detailed, as you can see. I'm actually going to go around the clock a little bit and just flag a few highlights for you. But we're now, as I mentioned, developing the indicators, searching out the data for these indicators as part of the pilot development. And there's a little bit of tweaking to this because of our partner input, but this is all published in our May 2022 work. But you can see it spans those 4 sustainability blocks. So let's start with, I think, the most important. As mentioned earlier, you cannot have a sustainable food system without profitable farms and companies. Profitability and success is vital for the whole system to work. This particular set of indicators really has 2 different aspects. One is that it includes lagging indicators. So what is the economic contribution of the sector to the Canadian economy? I think it's important to start with understanding its significance, the number of jobs it creates, its contribution to GDP, basic stuff. I think it's important just to create that baseline. But then it gets into a series of leading indicators of change, that if we want to be more sustainable, we need an innovation and regulatory and financial response to enable the sustainability journey. So some of the indicators we get in here would be, for example, regulatory approvals for new innovative practices, which would include novel foods, chemistry that we need to grow our food. We need to track that because that is actually a key driver of a sustainable food system within the context of a successful economic contribution. One of the big challenges in this set of indicators, and this will happen throughout, is we don't have enough good data, and that has sort of been an interesting development. So when the partners were developing these indicators, they came together and went, okay, through quite a process, here are our priority things we want to measure. The most significant was not the list of things to measure. In my mind, the most significant was consensus among that broad partnership on the data gaps. That's the first time that this really diverse sector started to agree on the data gaps. This is important because if we want to measure things like R&D input, sustainable finance, and we don't have the data, then how do we know that we're positioning ourselves for this changing marketplace? Societal well-being, this may look like a small set, and to pick up again on an earlier conversation, the social sustainability aspects are enormously important and are actually ramping up really fast. Environment gets a lot of the attention, and climate for sure, but the social aspects are vital. This has to do a lot with the workforce, the sustainable workforce, meaning how are we making job opportunities available for women and underrepresented groups? What about mental well-being of producers? These are captured here where the data exists. We get into, and I mentioned earlier, some of the stickiness or fuzziness around the consumer-facing. We do tip into food security, insecurity issues, which is about affordability of food. That's not agriculture and food policy, that's social and economic policy. So we recognize that we sort of move a little bit away from our intended scope, but we want to be relevant, and we have to acknowledge that there are issues here important to Canadian communities and families, and so there's a little bit of attention devoted to this. And of course, this includes Indigenous communities and some of the major food challenges that community, those nations are facing. Also in here are animal care codes. Then we move to food integrity. I mentioned earlier that this was a development, that fourth leg of the stool. This is a really interesting area, safe food. We all say or like to think that this is a safe food system. What's the data point that backs that up? I had a hard time finding it too. In fact, it's buried somewhere, but we found it. In fact, over 98% of Canadian foods that are tested by the CFIA are deemed safe and responsibly presented. So we can use that in the marketplace, not to rest on our laurels, but for a food sector to emphasize that this is a key attribute of the Canadian food brand. This indicator block also includes things such as antimicrobial resistance, zoonotic disease, some of the other animal aspects, and there's a number of other things in here. A whole bunch of factors really speak to not only just safe food, but the integrity of the food system. And we need to promote that, because if we don't, again, others will position themselves as being better, and I don't think we want to let that happen. And then finally, of course, we have environment. I've called out just a few things here. This spans all the things you would imagine, GHG emissions, biodiversity, soil health, right down to packaging waste, which is relevant to Clean Farms, again, another partner, among other things. And this is really where we saw some of the data gaps. So much of the data that we have, such as for pesticide and fertilizer use, is sales-based data. That's not outcomes-based data, yet the marketplace, the investor, the consumer, companies, they want to know what's happening. So this is where the collaboration of the partners got together in a non-confrontational, consensus-driven process, and we've started to come up with ideas about how to get better measures here. Now, we need to invest in data to do this properly, so those won't be available in the pilot, but it's indicative of the opportunity. It's also recognized here where Canada is taking some leading responses, and certainly on the sequestration and what's been happening to make this a more sustainable food system will be profiled significantly here, because this is where a huge contribution is being made by producers across the country. Okay, so the learnings from those three slides, for where we are today in developing these indicators, 3 learnings, and I've sort of mentioned this. Big limitation that we tried to address is, what is the data that we have and have not? What's the opportunity? Well, what's the data we need to respond? And a big caution, well, we've got to be careful how we use this data. This gets to the issue of greenwashing, and we can talk, and I'll put it in these terms. We cannot talk about leadership unless we talk about shortcomings. Because if we only talk about one, we will get blown out of the water. We need a balanced response, and this is what's intended to help provide that perspective. Okay, I believe that what's happening, therefore, is that these discussions on global sustainability is really defining how countries respond to the issue. I think it's redefining advantage, and that if a country can respond to this differently, then I think being aligned is the big, big opportunity. The Australians are doing it, Australian producers, New Zealand producers, American producers, and the list goes on. And I think Canadian producers and the Canadian food system can be actual leaders in this space. This is what we're trying to do. Okay, so what must be done? Right now we're in this pilot phase. We're sourcing all the data. We have another set of projects about how do we interpret the results? How do we answer that top question? How sustainable, or is the Canadian agriculture food system sustainable? How do we know? Let's provide some perspective, balanced perspective on that. We're actually, even though the index is not yet launched, we're actually learning and applying it right now. So we're doing it concurrently because we're moving quickly. And then we want to plan for the future, and that is, how do we set up this Center for Agri-Food Benchmarking to help take this work forward and make it a more robust piece of work so that we can use in the marketplace and with regulators and with consumers and others. I should add that Manitoba has been particularly involved in this work. I'm thinking across the food system. We have 2 projects in this pilot, just to call out. One is some work on environmental indicators, which is helping to input on our thinking. And another is that Food and Beverage Manitoba is thinking about how to apply this index, even though it's not yet fully populated, and how to apply it to its membership to start gearing up and align its members, SMEs, food processing, on how they can better respond to sustainability. And an important part of that, in my advice to them as we do this, is you have to, thinking of what we've talked about earlier, you have to include the ingredient provider in those discussions, because it's a supply chain response that's being measured at the end of the day. So what's the final learning? I think that self-interest has to drive this. Every partner around that table, this table, is there because they are trying to advance their interests. That's perfectly legitimate. They're also there because they're pursuing a common intent. They realize that in order to pursue their self-interest, they need to be part of this other agenda, which is developing this index, which can reap, hopefully, benefits for all as we move forward. I'm not saying it's a panacea. It's not going to fix everything, but I think it could become a pretty interesting tool to help us respond. So what can you do? I think clearly part of this is telling your story. This is a familiar refrain, but I think that with better evidence and data, I think it's possible. I'm actually reaching out to all the partners to submit a so-called partner profile, a really short item about how you can use the index to advance your sector, your interests, your members' interests, and we'll present that with all of the others. I think that's going to be a pretty cool reflection of the diversity of response, and so that's a work in progress right now. I think you could be a champion. I think CAP has done a tremendous job in representing your interests around the table, and I think that how you champion the coalition and trying to leverage this, again, for self-interest and common intent, I think is possible, and I think can help inform policy, such as perhaps the Sustainable Agriculture Policy strategy, which is under development right now. And can this actually be a way to improve the work, our work? How can we take your ideas and input and make sure it's sharpened and more relevant so that this can be made more useful and important for down the road? So we're really open to feedback. That's been part of our process to date. So finally, yes, this index will have some limitations, but can it confer an edge? And I think that every partner around the table right now believes this is worth developing so that we can do so. So thank you very much to CAP for giving me the opportunity to be here today. Thank you to CAP and the other partners in the room for being part of our process. Really appreciate it, and open to any questions that anyone might have. Thank you.
Well, I don't see anybody stepping up to the mic, but I guess I will engage in a question, that part. But I have always been under the assumption that index assumes a numerical assessment with that particular part. And I know that when we go through all of those pillars, how will numerical assessment be assigned to the importance, and are they weighed, and how do we engage in that part of assessment, so to establish an index?
Yeah, great question. The short answer is yes, but not now. And the reason is the first task, which is the pilot, is our first order of business is let's accumulate the data. Let's make sure that the metrics are phrased right. We've morphed some, we've deleted some. We don't have data for many. So we're trying to figure out how to populate this and to create that baseline. Now, there will be some time series information in there. GHG emissions is some of the best data that we have across the country that can help, as I mentioned, show what producers are doing, for example, in managing their emissions as a consolidated view. So there's a little bit of that now. But over time, I think that's exactly where we need to go, which is how do we develop this or evolve this so we can sort of get to a better ranking or some form of a more useful, user-friendly tool to assess. That's going to require weightings. We have not had that discussion. We've deferred it. We said we can't do that. Weightings meaning how do you weight biodiversity versus water? Are they equal indicators? How do you rank that versus innovation or social inclusion? And so we're just not ready to go there because you just got to get the data first in that baseline. But I think that the weighting issue is going to be, that's why we need a diverse set of folks around the table. This can be done poorly. It can be done that can miss the mark, and we need to do this very carefully. So that was a key reason why we deferred it until we're ready.
Hi, David. I've heard this 3 or 4 times. Every time it makes more sense. Daryl Dimitrick, I work for the Manitoba.
To me too.
Yeah, I work for Manitoba Pulse and soybean growers. So, David, I'm not really going to ask you a question, but I'm going to use the opportunity of your presentation to, I guess, make a plea emerging out of the discussions we have around our table. We've talked about the big investment that's needed just to quantify what we're doing. The data matters. And I'm going to make a plea here that I think, particularly in the context of a provincial group like CAP and our commodity groups, we need to really put a Manitoba lens on this, because I think we're quite a bit behind other jurisdictions in a provincial sense in quantifying where we're at. And I'm concerned about that because as these global issues play out in each of our locations like Manitoba, we're seeing that number one, the metrics are getting more and more difficult to understand. And so, back in the 1980s, sustainability was all about soil conservation, and farmers had that, right? They controlled the narrative, they achieved soil conservation. But then it became about water. Water was added into that. Was a little tougher, and we're still struggling with that. And now it's about colorless, odorless gases called atmospheric emissions. That's even tougher to get our head around. And I see other jurisdictions moving ahead a little more forthrightly than we are here in Manitoba. And we want to move forward in a science-based way. We always say that, and this is where my concern comes in. Number one, we talked about carbon in the last round of presentations. Science out of the University of Saskatchewan has shown that the crop industry in Saskatchewan and Alberta are now net sinks of greenhouse gas emissions. In Manitoba, we're very much still a net emitter. And the reason is that tillage practices in Saskatchewan and Alberta have gone to the extent where, A, they've eliminated summer fallow. We never had a whole lot of that, but we've eliminated it as well. But the zero-till practice is much more extensive. Now, I know why it's not more extensive here. There's good reasons. The fact is, we are, according to the science, we are far, far away in this province from being a sink for greenhouse gas emissions. Number two, more science. Mario Tenuta has shown over and over again, as early as Ag Days the other day, that our fertilizer use is going up in Manitoba. Now, there's good reasons for that, because we live in the eastern prairies. It's more of a humid, subhumid climate. Our crops respond to fertilizer, and it makes sense. But the fact remains that our emissions are going up, not down, because we're using more fertilizer. Number three, the other prairie provinces have a long, long history of using annual legumes, which don't emit nitrous oxide, and Mario's shown that over and over again. We have started to do that by growing more soybeans, but the threats are there. It's far from guaranteed that we will continue to grow things like peas and soybeans. In fact, peas are under significant threat from disease and excess moisture. What I'm saying is there's a Manitoba lens that needs to be applied to all this, and the sooner we do that, the better we're going to be able to get on top of some of these global trends that you're talking about, David. And I just think that between CAP and the provincial commodity groups, we really need to apply that Manitoba lens and not just associate ourselves with the prairies or Canada, because we have to do our part. In that regard, I'm reminded that a key part of this are these programs that the provincial minister was espousing the other day. I feel these programs are wholly insufficient. They're from the soil conservation days, but now we got water and climate and social and all these things. The expectations that have been piled on us over and over and over again are calling on us to really take a look as Manitobans. And so I'm just kind of using this forum to suggest that, CAP is a great organization to lead that discussion and put a Manitoba lens on it. We look good from an overall emissions perspective for two reasons. One is we have very little heavy industry, which can be also a commentary on our economy, but also we have basically 100% emission-free hydropower. So as Manitobans, we look good, but as farmers in Manitoba, when you look at the science, we've got a long way to go, and we better get on with it, because the folks in Saskatchewan are really, really setting the tone and leading on some of these things. So I just wanted to make that suggestion based on the global pressures, David, that you've clearly outlined in your presentation. So thanks, Bill.
Well, thanks very much for those comments. I'm not going to comment on it because I think it was meant for everyone, but someone wants to respond to that. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that. Please go ahead. Any other comments or questions? I'd like to hear anyone's concerns. David, I knew that would set you up.
So full disclosure, I was on the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute when David was the executive director, so we go back a ways. So in some cases, he doesn't need enemies because he's got friends like me. But, and I'm sorry I wasn't in the whole thing, so you may have covered this. But I'm not going to ask you about the word sustainability this time. But when I was doing a course from Guelph last year on climate-smart soils, we had to do a case study in PI. And on that farm, it was primarily potatoes, big guess or big surprise. But they also had 85 dairy cows, 180 beef cows, and they finished the beef cattle. And essentially, they did it on a dry lot, 8 acres, so there was no real interaction with the soil. So you could easily take that model and take out the cattle and not have to change too much else. But the model showed that without the cattle, the crop production part was 250 tons per year, but you add the cattle in, it was 3,500, so like 15 times higher. But there is evidence that if you handle the cattle right, you can actually be a net sink. And there is data from University of California that suggests that there's a biogenic methane cycle. So when the cattle eat the grass and they belch the methane, which we can manage to some degree, it goes to the atmosphere. It's got a half-life of something like 10 or 12 years. It's oxidized, it goes to carbon dioxide. The grass absorbs it, grows, the cattle eat it, and goes around and around. And if you don't change the cattle number, it doesn't change the net emissions. But yet some of these models put things like cattle in a hugely bad light from an emissions and sustainability point of view. So how do we address that? That goes right up to the UN calculations.
Thanks, David. Yes, whenever you do ask a question, there's always a lot to it. There's a number of aspects, but I'm going to actually pick up on the very last point because it has more of a policy significance that I can comment on. And that is, and I didn't actually mention it, so I'm sort of glad you raised it, is how does Canada have influence on global standards developments or rule setting? And of course, Canada's around these tables, and I'm not trying to pass judgment on any particular player around those tables, but it is relevant in terms of how these sustainability requirements are being set. And I think as a major exporter, of which we are, plus we have integrated supply relationships with companies around the world, particularly the United States, of course, these standards and definitions matter. And if we're not at these tables representing our vision of agriculture and how it can be more sustainable and stepping up and showing how we're benchmarking that change, I think we may be losing, or we have an opportunity to sort of punch above our weight, if you will, in how these global standards are being developed. And as you well know, if you have influence on the standard, you set the terms of trade for generations, potentially. So I think there's a global opportunity for Canada here beyond just the sending product to market to satisfy consumer, customer preference for their food. I think there's an opportunity how we play and how we set or influence, maybe not set, but how we have influence on the rules. And I think that's an opportunity. But I think it comes with currency, and that currency is to show credibility for what we're doing. That requires data. And I can guarantee you that the Australians are thinking this way, because that's what they've said. That's why they're benchmarking themselves so that they can have access to the European marketplace. The Europeans, through their green plan, want to express essentially green diplomacy, using their vision of and their definition of sustainability to influence the terms of trade according to how they see it. So I'm not just making this up. This is actually already happening. So to David's point, there was a lot to what you had to say. I think that it does spark an idea about strategically how we advance our collective interests in the global marketplace. And that's not a criticism of how that's being done. It's a reflection of how massively complex this question, this issue of sustainability and measuring it is becoming around the world. So just an opportunity for us that I probably should have profiled.
Well, thank you very much, David. In lieu of speaker gifts, we will be making a donation to Manitoba Harvest. So once again, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we'll take a short break, and then we will resume with resolutions in 10 minutes. Health break for 10 minutes.